Good afternoon, everyone. As James indicated, I'm Betsy Vereen, Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs here at Consumer Brands. We are extremely excited to have you join us for this industry solution session. This series provides insights for CPG companies presented by our premier partners of Consumer Brands. PwC is among the leading professional services networks in the world. They help organizations and individuals create the value that they're looking for. In addition to working with their clients, PwC serves as one of Consumer Brands' premier strategic partners, and we thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to bring in Katrina Carrizales, Partner Cyber Risk and Regulatory for PwC. Katrina has more than 15 years of experience and is the consumer markets industry lead on cyber risk and regulatory platform. Katrina focuses on helping clients prevent, confront, and remediate regulatory, legal, and commercial challenges that arise. During this session, Katrina will share her insights on how companies can manage the influx of the various vaccine accommodation requests and develop processes related to vaccine mandates. Katrina will also discuss how companies can navigate the varying levels of trust and comfort among employee groups. We're going to save some time at the end of the session for an audience Q&A. And if you have a question during today's session, please submit it to the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. Katrina, we're excited to have you share your experience with our attendees today, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Awesome, Betsy. Thank you so much, and happy Tuesday, everybody. Good afternoon and or morning to the West Coast attendees. I hope everyone's having a great start to their week. As Betsy said, my name is Katrina Carrizales, and I'm a partner in our cyber risk and regulatory practice. I focus on investigations, forensics, and crisis management. So I've spent the majority of my career helping my clients respond to or handle different situations and or unplanned events. I like to say that I live in a very event-driven world. So with this really means that I focus on helping clients solve some of their most complex problems by helping them either stand up or operationalize different command centers or centers of excellences to respond to these different types of events. So for example, right now we're talking about COVID-19, and if you are going to mandate the vaccine, can you stand up some sort of center of excellence to respond to the number of accommodation requests that you might receive related to that vaccination policy? All of which, when I typically do these types of projects, it involves bringing together a cross-functional team to respond. So this involves HR, legal, and different parts of the business. I do need to open up by saying I am not an attorney and I am not providing legal advice throughout this presentation. I do not provide legal advice, and PwC is not in the business of providing legal advice. So I really will be focused on providing insights and key considerations on this topic at hand, and based on my knowledge and experience that I've worked on with other different organizations. So with that, I'm really going to focus today's session on how to operationalize a return to office vaccine policy while I'm building employee trust. We can go to the next slide. This is me if you need any of my information. Here you are. Next slide, please. So what is kind of the issue at hand that we're talking about, or the current state? So as companies continue to plan and evolve their return to office strategy in this environment, many have already, and some are considering mandating that their employees be vaccinated. We have all hopefully heard or seen Biden's announcement a couple weeks ago, where he has walked through his new plan about potentially directing the Labor Department to require all businesses with 100 or more employees to ensure their workers are either vaccinated or tested once a week. More to come on this guidance, as we're all waiting for that. But with all of this, we are seeing some organizations do this mandate as part of employment, or others are doing it only if those employees want to return to the actual office physically. So either way, as part of this process or effort, there are a few things that I'd like to walk through that companies should consider thinking through, and what I'd like to walk through today on just some key considerations if you are going to consider the mandate of vaccines or if you already have. So first, it's that potential strain that you might be placed on HR or legal resources with such a mandate, and how will they be able to handle that? And then it's how do you operationalize such a mandate? This requires really thinking through optimizing the request. So for example, the intake, what questions are you going to ask your employees? What data or support will you ask them to either upload or collect? Then that review, what will that process look like? Who will need to review it? Will it be HR, legal, the business? What will that workflow look like? And then approvals, who needs to actually approve of the actual accommodation? And then once you do have that accommodation, what will the accommodation be? For example, regular testing, working remotely, unpaid leave. And then finally, how can you use technology to help with that workflow or case management? So that's kind of the operational piece, and we'll dig into what that workflow might look like later in the session today. Other considerations or things to consider are the process to actually handle just the new complexities in employees' requests. So for example, a lot of organizations have had a process to handle medical exemptions or medical accommodations, but this idea of a religious accommodation is something new that maybe they haven't experienced in the past. So how do you handle that complexity or some of the gray that we find in there? And then lastly, you can use this opportunity if you decide to mandate vaccines or if we go down that path of the federal mandate, can you use it as an opportunity to educate your employees and really help build trust with them throughout the process? So when we've talked to clients who've already gone through this or helping them kind of stand up these different center of excellences, we've had a few key areas that we've seen a lot of organizations potentially struggle with. The first one is on just resources. So limited resources to actually support an influx of COVID-19 related HR requests. So if you do mandate the vaccine, you then need to allow for a medical or religious accommodation. And so you could have a large influx of those requests come in. So do you have the team, the right number of people to be able to work through and process those and review those different medical and religious accommodations? The other one is you might not have any sort of operational process that existed beforehand, so you don't have something in place. And then how do you leverage technology to actually support a new vaccine mandate or those guidelines as an organization that you have drafted? So a lot of organizations, again, maybe are familiar with medical, but not religious. So how do you make sure that you have the right processes in place to help that you have a consistent process for all of your employees when you do have such mandate? And then lastly, I think there's been a number of questions on just the lack of clarity when handling vaccine accommodations and requests. I know there was an announcement that went out yesterday for federal agencies and kind of gave guidelines on what those medical and religious accommodations would look like in the overall process. We're all waiting for the federal mandate as it relates to other organizations that are not federal agencies. So hopefully there'll be more guidance, but clearly right now there's a lot of gray. And so just how do you navigate some of that, all with this mind that you want your employees to have a good experience and make sure that's a consistent process while building their trust throughout it. So let's give some additional background. If we go to the next slide, I've talked about that there's two main types of accommodations. And so the first one is around medical accommodations. And so Title I of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, requires employers must provide reasonable accommodation to employees who are unable to receive vaccines due to a medical reason, unless the employer can demonstrate that doing so creates an undue hardship to the employer or poses a direct threat to the safety of employees or others in the workplace. So the employer can verify the employee's need for medical accommodation by either requesting documentation. So for example, a doctor's confirmation of that medical condition, a detailed request of the limitations due a condition are things that we've seen. The employee can provide that appropriate documentation either from his or her healthcare provider requesting regarding the nature of the accommodation and or any impairments. Also, we're talking through the duration of the need for the accommodation and to the extent which the impairment conflicts truly with the employer's vaccination requirement. So we've also seen clients consider the history of like the allergic reaction to vaccines as part of their policy or guidelines. So really saying you need to have an overall process to have this medical accommodation. Are you going to ask for supporting documentation? How are you going to collect it and go from there? We've even seen some companies set up how strict their boundaries are going to be and if they're going to evaluate it. For example, maybe some people want to have proof or a doctor's note. Others might just want them to fill out a form and they're going to take it at that. So a lot of opportunity for you to decide how you actually want to engage with your employees around their medical accommodation and what information you're going to ask to request. The second one, if we go to the next slide, please, is around the religious accommodation. So similar to medical, employers also have an obligation to accommodate an employee's sincerely held religious belief under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, unless the accommodation creates an undue hardship. So a sincerely held religious belief can include an employee's religious-based objection to vaccinations. So again, the employee can provide an explanation of his or her sincerely held religious beliefs, and if necessary, provide appropriate documentation from his or her religious leader regarding the religious belief and how that conflicts with the employer's vaccination requirement. Something interesting between the two type of accommodations is actually the threshold for defining undue hardship for religious accommodations under Title VII is actually lower than the ADA standards for medical accommodations. So if I want to dig into that a little bit, the threshold for defining undue hardship for religious accommodations under Title VII is actually says under the ADA, an undue hardship is defined as an acting requiring significant difficulty or expense. So action requiring a significant difficulty or expense. And so what does that actually mean? Factors that can be considered in determining if an undue hardship exists can be 1, the nature and cost of that accommodation, 2, the financial resources of the business, 3, the overall size of the business, including the number and locations, and then 4, the operations of the business, including the composition of the workforce. However, under religious discrimination claims, an undue hardship is actually the lower standard because it only requires a more than de minimis cost or minimum cost or burden on the operation of an employer's business. So as you can see, there is a lot more gray in that religious accommodation space, and that's where we've seen a lot of organizations struggle or trying to find more guidance, leveraging internal or outside counsel to really figure out if we're going to apply a consistent process, what can you accommodate or not, and how do you actually then operationalize that? And we'll walk through some of the key kind of considerations if you want to build kind of a process around that. So as that also relates to this religious accommodation space, just some of the things that we're seeing out in the marketplace. So clients are asking questions about vaccination history and or church attendance, really trying to build the full case for why they should or should not accommodate. One area that's gotten a lot of attention is around employees saying that their religious belief is that the vaccine uses fetal cells in research, testing, or production, and so that should not be put into their bodies. So this is, again, where there's been a lot of variability in how organizations are being as strict or not as strict as it relates to the accommodation request. For example, there's an organization out there that said, all right, if you're going to tell me there's a religious belief that you don't want to use fetal cells in research, so that's why you cannot take the vaccine, that organization has then provided all of their employees with a list of 28 commonly used medicines that have all used fetal cells in their research, testing, or development. That includes things like Tylenol, Motrin, Tums, and they've asked them, those company employees, to certify and or attest that they're not using any of those. So that's a very extreme situation where we've seen organizations actually ask for that if they're going to make the request for a religious accommodation based on fetal cells. Another area of consideration as it relates to the religious request world is a lot of organizations are not focused necessarily on the specific religion, but doing that assessment of the accommodation request on how is the employee truly tying their religious belief to having an impact on getting the vaccine due to that religious belief held. So for example, a sample question that if you're having your employees fill out a form or however you're gathering the information to make that determination is specifically describe the conflict between your religious belief, observance, or practice, and then that organization's COVID-19 vaccination requirement. So really making that tie, not just saying that you are of a specific religion, but how does that actually then tie to you not being able to get a vaccine? So how far do you want to go? How many questions do you want to ask? It's something that we're helping clients kind of think through. One of the key considerations as it relates to religious belief is how will your organization define or view a sincerely held belief. And so that is when you're going to do a vaccine mandate, really trying to define like how do you as an organization define sincerely held, because that's kind of where a lot of questions are coming from. There is the opportunity, though, for education and to help build trust with your employees related to this, because a number of individuals have been upset or have spoken out about that they're offended that someone is saying they need to have a sincerely held belief, but this is the legal language. This isn't an organization saying it must be sincerely held. It's actually the legal language. So providing that education and guidance really is a great way to just kind of build that trust and help educate them along this process as guidance is changing, continuing to come out, but just making sure everyone's following the guidance that they have. So if we go to the next slide, please. What are some potential impacts and what should you be considering if you want to actually do a vaccine mandate or roll out a vaccine policy? So a few key reasons why there is a need to actually truly plan effectively when preparing to roll out a vaccine mandate and then being able to handle the accommodation request, come up with 4 that we can dig into a little bit. The first one jumps up to the top of the list is mitigating risk and potential litigation, having that in mind. So this is where this process on how you're going to actually go out and do your mandate, have your policy, and then require everyone to be mandated by a certain date. Whatever process you put in place or whatever center of excellence you stand up, you need to make sure that it's a consistent process that's gathering all the necessary information that you need to then make such a determination and being able to have that supporting documentation. So if and when litigation comes down the line, you have a nice package of supporting evidence and you can say that you've followed a consistent process and here's the different steps and approvals that went along the way, and you've got all of your information kind of ready to go for that. We've seen in the press organizations where lawsuits have already been filed as employees are saying that the process was not fair. Examples of unfair practice were included that some employees were not asked any follow-up questions, or some employees were asked to go get a letter related to their accommodation request or an actual upload of some sort of documentation, and others would not. So really that's trying to mitigate that risk and potential litigation, doing that upfront by establishing what that workflow is going to look like, making sure you've got the right business partners involved, so that you have a consistent process that you can then legally defend or be defensible down the line. As we've actually been helping a number of organizations think through what that process might look like, the big piece we've talked about is how are you going to actually collect that supporting documentation? Because you're talking about very sensitive topics and sensitive information on both the medical side, so PHI, and on the religious belief side, PII. So making sure that you're really making sure you're getting the information that you need, and how are you gathering that, keeping that information safe and protected, and then applying the consistent process throughout. The second consideration is around just the support for your HR and legal teams. So depending on the size of your organization and or just location or where you might be and or a lot of reasons, like kind of who is your employee base and what are the different demographics, are you going to have the support from your HR and legal teams or enough arms and legs to handle an influx of accommodations requests that can come if and when you do mandate or if there is a federal mandate. So making sure you've got the right folks that can apply that consistent process to help with such a mandate. And the last one, and I focus on this one, sorry, it's not the last one, the third one, I focus on this one a lot in the consumer market space, is really that brand protection, that brand equity. And so it is so important for you guys in this space to make sure nothing is damaging to your brand. And so making sure that you, again, have a nice process that is being consistent, you've taken into account D&I considerations. It's just really critical to have a process that everyone is following consistently throughout, that your employees feel that they can trust and they can get behind. And so it's not that one person in a different part of the country is going to be accommodated, or you're going to have a different demographic that is they're always getting the exceptions approved and the others are not. So making sure that you have a defensible position and or approach being followed. And the last one, depending on the size of your organization, or just being able to understand who's requesting the accommodations, how many are you approving, are they related to religious or medical, really relates to unlocking some of the key reporting and metrics. So wanting to be able to present to leadership, wanting just to understand how much of your organization is vaccinated versus not, being able just to have some of these key data points. So building that up on the front end, so when you actually do roll out your mandate and or stand up a vaccine center of excellence is what I've been calling them, you've got all of that up front, top of mind. If we go to the next slide, this is really a sample of what would this workflow look like. So here's kind of an example of an overall process. If you were going to say we're going to mandate vaccines, what are kind of the 5 steps, Katrina, that we should really be thinking through? Again, this changes from organization to organization, but these are pretty much the top high-level buckets that I think we can dig into. And if there's questions on this at the end, happy to answer. But what does this look like from start to finish? So typically you've got key parties that are involved. They're going to be your HR, legal, and business teams, your employees or resources, and then what I call the accommodation team. That's the team that's actually kind of doing this first initial review. So going and getting the information, making sure forms are filled out appropriately, looking at whatever documents have been attached, really doing that first kind of big lift before maybe you pass it on to HR or legal or whomever it's going to be in your workflow. And then any executives, because there might be some situations where employees are extremely disgruntled or angry. You need to have an escalation process built out. So those would be the 4 key parties that we've seen involved, and a number of organizations where we're talking through just Vaccine Policy Center of Excellences and or how are they handling their vaccine mandates. So what are these actual steps? So we've got 5 key steps shown on the screen. The first one is to establish and implement your policy and or guidelines. So what is going to be your COVID or your vaccine mandate? So are you going to have an accommodations policy, or is it just going to be written in your overall vaccine mandate policy? And of course, you're going to have a process to allow for medical or religious accommodations. So coming up with 1, what is the policy that will go out to your employees? And 2, how are you going to communicate that to them? How are you going to bring them along this journey? How are you going to instill the trust in them? Like, you really want to make sure that they're understanding where this is coming from, how this ties to your values. So that communication piece is very critical. And so after you have that, then people will usually have their policy, and then there's also going to be a number of guidelines. So what are you as an organization, as I spoke about earlier, how are you going to define a sincerely held belief? Like, what does sincerely held mean? And so understanding and aligning as a leadership team or who's ever going to be handling this process and what that means. So you'll kind of have those guidelines. You have the policy, you'll have your guidelines and or FAQs. FAQs have been extremely important. So you can document and make sure that you're providing all of your employees that are requesting certain accommodations with consistent messaging and responses. So being able to have a living and breathing document for FAQs just to ensure that everyone's getting the same interaction or process. So that's step 1. Really, you've got the policy, you've communicated it out, you've told them how they can actually interact with the organization as it relates if they want to request a medical or religious or both accommodations. So the second step is really around what I like to call the interactive process. And so this is, how are your employees going to actually be able to file or submit for an accommodation? So if they want to submit for either a medical or a religious, or sometimes people are submitting for both, how are they going to do that? Is it going to be filling out a paper form? Are you going to have technology where they can go? Or are you going to use a Google form or a SurveyMonkey? What is that process that will allow them to answer a predetermined set of questions that you have agreed to as a leadership team? And then what information are you going to ask for them about do they need to upload any supporting documentation or submit any supporting documentation? Are they filling out a PDF form and sending it to their local HR team? So just really thinking through that overall intake process. And we've seen a number of organizations that have actually just built tech or leveraged different technologies to assist with that workflow and how the employees are actually interacting and filling out a form and then uploading. We've helped organizations with the technology aspect by using Microsoft Power Platform. So that's an easy way to stand up something pretty quickly so that your employees can come in, have a form to fill out, and then it does a case management. So it follows through the rest of the steps of the process shown or workflow shown on the slide. Another key kind of consideration, there's a lot that happens in this intake. So before you actually have the form filled out, what data do you actually need? So consideration around D&I. So what data do you need to know? Okay, you want to know the employee's name. Do you need to know location? Do you need to know their business unit? Trying to figure out what do you actually need to make a true determination on either a medical or religious accommodation. And then you want to make sure you're not having any unconscious bias. So there's always nice to have. You could have them fill out a form with 100 questions, but really what are the key demographics that you need to know, just kind of about their business information, and then what questions do you want to ask? So you've got the employee, they've gone through, they've done the first part of the intake, and then what we talk about within this is where that accommodation team or someone kind of that first level review is sitting to really review and follow up that interactive process again with the employee for completeness and to make sure all the documentation is what you're looking for to make that determination. So if they said, I've attached a doctor's note, it shows why I need this medical accommodation, and you don't see a doctor's note. Or they make a statement where your policy requires a doctor's note and there's nothing uploaded or provided. So going back and forth, really again, with kind of either that litigation or brand protection in mind, wanting to know that you've got a full supporting package of evidence to then continue down the workflow to make that determination as it relates to either a religious or medical accommodation. The other interesting part about this, and not only are organizations testing for completeness and making sure they've got a nice package before it continues through the workflow, we're seeing a lot of organizations that are trying to do some analytics around the responses that they're receiving from their employees. Meaning that if person A in this business unit has applied for a religious accommodation and they had certain language that was submitted and it met your guidelines, and everyone between HR, legal, and the business said it wouldn't put undue hardship on the business, so it gets approved. We've then seen at clients where now you're seeing that language that's been being used for certain responses to questions being copy and pasted. And so trying to, again, go back, how do you trust your employees? Are you going to go back to your ethical policy? But making sure if you can actually do some review on responses that are being submitted by either leveraging technology or however they're coming into your organization, to see if you see a lot of the exact same language being submitted just because you've got people that are talking about it. So just something to look out for as you go down this. And so once you've got the full package, you've had that interactive process, depending on your organization. Some organizations are having HR do that first review, others are having legal do that first review, whatever it might be, and then working through usually legal, HR, and the business. So if there's questions, if you need to have legal, HR, and the business getting on daily calls or every other day calls, just to really see some of the themes that you're seeing, but making sure that, hey, okay, is there a business need for this? They have the accommodation request. Is there going to be undue hardship? Just making sure you work through kind of all of that in that intake, and then going from there. And so that brings you to the third step, which is really around just the internal decision making. So if you've got this internal decision, so HR, business, and legal needs to decide to accommodate, yes or no, based on the policy and the guidelines. And then if you are going to make that accommodation, what actually is going to be the accommodation? Weekly testing, virtual work, unpaid leave. So again, part of your policy and guidelines really need to think through what will be the different accommodations that you are offering your employees if those are approved. And then we've seen in a lot of situations where HR and legal might say yes, but then if it gets to the business and they say, well, if we actually say yes to this one, there's going to be a very undue hardship put on the rest of the business due to either the workspace that they're working in, that employee, or the location. So really making sure you have alignment between those internal teams, and then having an escalation process figured out, because sometimes there might be non-agreement between those three. So how are you going to escalate if you need to, making sure that's figured out. So that brings you time to ask to step 4, just that overall escalation. And then lastly, step 5, communicating to the employee. So a lot of this is, are you going to send an email? Are you going to say approved or denied? What will that language be like? Has legal blessed that language? When you say that it is approved, are you then making sure that you include it is approved for how long? What is the actual accommodation? So a lot throughout all of this process, 1 through 5, what are those predefined templates? Again, thinking through the consistent process, making sure that each step along the way, you're having the same experience for all of your employees that are going through it. So rather than sending emails, a lot of organizations want actually more of that personal interactive process. So getting phone calls. So is HR going to then call the employee to let them know that it's been approved or denied, and making sure you're then tracking all of that, those accommodations, so you understand what was the time for each accommodation, and then also what was the actual accommodation, so that you can track that through however long that time period may be. Throughout this entire workflow, where we've really been trying to get a lot of organizations to think through is just how can you leverage technology, because there are so many different steps. You have a lot of people interacting it related to HR, legal, and business. Do HR managers need to be CC'd? So how can you really make sure from the intake, that you are collecting all of the evidence that you need to make that determination, but then also you've got sensitive data that you're handling. So how are you making sure that that information is safe and protected? And then you want to be able to have that audit trail. So as you're moving through your workflow, who's making what decision when? And so at the end of the day, you've got a nice supporting package of this was the consistent process that was followed, and here were all those steps, and here's the evidence that was provided and why we made the determination that we made. Other considerations, especially within this space, is employees. How are you going to actually do the intake? Can they actually all have access to computers? Are they going to be able to fill out a form? Do they have to do handwritten forms on PDF from their HR? So making sure you think through kind of all your different interactions with your employees, so that you're giving everyone a fair and consistent opportunity to apply for an accommodation, either for religious or medical reasons. We can go to the next slide. So just through the experience of doing this for the last little bit, a lot of our clients have been like, what are some key things that I should think about if I am going to mandate, or if I've already mandated, that I just want to make sure that everyone is thinking through. So two different areas here. The first one is around policy considerations, so HR and legal guidance. So really for the consumer market space, or this group on the phone, if you have employees that are customer facing or public facing, so in stores, what that might look like, what are you going to do for that? Are you going to have a different policy for people that are either customer or public facing versus employees that are not? So thinking through what is the guidance going to be, and making sure HR and legal has aligned on that, because it's really important if you're going to be interacting with other individuals that are outside of the organization. How are you thinking through that when it comes to your policy, and what may maybe look different? Also, as it relates to your policy, timing is a big issue. So making sure that you're giving reasonable amount of time from your mandate date. So, hey, everyone must be mandated, or everyone must be vaccinated by X date. Are you giving enough employees enough time, 6 weeks or so, to actually get the vaccine? But then also, if someone is going to be denied an accommodation, making sure that they then have time to get vaccinated. So they might get denied their religious accommodation request, but then they will need to actually be able to get vaccinated. So how are you going to handle that timing? So just kind of things that you're maybe not thinking out up front, but really if someone that gets denied, you need to make sure that you're providing the right guidance and timing for them to then, if they make the decision to get vaccinated, to do such. And I think for yesterday, there was new guidance that came out for federal agencies that first shot must be received at least 2 weeks, within 2 weeks of an exemption being requested and denied. So just making sure that they at least have those 2 weeks. FAQs are very important. You want to make sure that you're documenting kind of different questions that are being asked, and that you have a consistent response. So how are you keeping that document real time and up to date? Because that's going to tie back to your policy and who you are as an organization. I can't stress the consistency enough of the actual application. So you have your policy, here's the process that's going to be followed, making sure that everyone is having a consistent process for their, as they're going through this accommodations request. Business needs, so if you do roll out a vaccine mandate or there's a federal mandate, are you going to have the HR and legal teams, how are they going to agree on the accommodation? If it's approved, what's going to be the impact to the business? So again, that goes back to the workflow that we were just talking about. What does that workflow look like, and how do you make sure that you've got everyone aligned and making sure you're thinking through the business needs? So what are potential impacts? I've talked about it a little bit throughout, but what does the diversity and inclusion impacts? So that goes to making sure you've got that D&I lens. So as when you're about to or thinking through mandating a vaccine, making sure you've got that care and consideration from a D&I perspective. When you are doing your intake form, what are the questions that are you asking? Again, what do you really need to know versus what's nice to have or not necessary to make the determination? There's a lot of talk just about the history of vaccines. And so making sure that you're having those conversations, or I'll go back to that term, the interactive process with your employees, because it really is about building trust and taking them on this process with the organization, because you know that you want to do what you're going to do as it relates to mandating vaccines, but you need your company, you need your employees to feel trusted as you're going through the process. Policies, we've had a number of organizations that have either done like a chatbot or call center. So if employees have questions, where are they going to go? Are they setting up an email inbox? Just because when you do something like this, you all have probably plenty of questions around just different type of the accommodations, specifically the religious ones, but how can people ask questions, and are you going to make sure they're giving them that opportunity or avenue to do such? And then talent retention. Talent retention has been a big area of discussion. And I think this is why a number of organizations are waiting to mandate the vaccine, because they'd rather have a federal mandate, because talent retention is so hard and there is a labor shortage. And so they don't want to be one of the first, second companies to come out and say they're mandating vaccines, because they risk employees leaving, and then it'd be much easier, or their hope is that if there's the federal mandate that goes through and guidance comes out, okay, what does that look like? And then can that help actually talent retention rather than having a mass exodus? So what would be that potential mandate? And the last one that we've seen throughout, especially within this industry, is just union requests. So negotiating with unions, how does that look like? What are you doing? Making sure that you're considering that. And then third-party vendor management. So you are going to have an internal, maybe your US employees only, you want to mandate vaccines, but does that then apply then also to your third party vendors? And if so, how are you going to handle that? Are you going to actually have them, you're going to manage the process for them? Or are you just going to ask them to certify or attest that all of their employees that are going to interact with you as an organization have been vaccinated or have the appropriate exemptions and or accommodations? So just another consideration is your policy going to touch on that or not? And then if I move over to the right side of the screen, workflow considerations. So as we talked about on the slide before, what does that workflow really look like? And so depending on how accommodating or not your policy is going to be related to a vaccine mandate, are you going to have the resource scalability to either scale up or scale down related to the number of accommodation requests that you might receive? So how many requests are you anticipating? Have you already surveyed your employees to understand the percentage that already are vaccinated? So potentially, if you looked at, if I had to understand if I'm going to mandate vaccines, what is that potential population that might request accommodations so that you can be prepared to handle that influx? Time zone coverage is another one as it relates to kind of the standard vaccine center of excellence, making sure that you have, is it just US, is it global, is it US and is it Mexico? The ability really truly just to cover the appropriate hours based on the business needs, so making sure that you've got that good time coverage. A number of organizations have thought through either VIP or white glove treatment. So how do you have the capability to prioritize the requests that are coming in? So do you do it by business level or function level, by title? Are there certain areas of your business that are more critical than others, meaning that you need to get through those accommodation requests faster because those individuals need to be out in the market or are just a critical piece to your organization? So making sure you've thought through, like, if you needed to prioritize or if there were certain white glove or VIP treatment, how would you handle? Executive reporting. So as you go through this, a lot of it is very gray. So coming up with what are those themes? What numbers are we seeing? Are we seeing a lot of similar themes related to the different types of religious accommodations that are being made? How are they actually tying it to a sincerely held belief? So what type of reporting do you want to be able to take up to your executive leadership team? And then a number of these after that really relates to technology. So if you're going to have a large influx, how really are you leveraging technology to just have a better user experience for your employees, but then to also have a consistent process being outlined, have a nice workflow built in. So status definition, so what means open versus in process, legally approved, all different kind of things of just what actually is a true status and how are you going to define certain things without your workflow. And then security control, so by user type. So depending if HR or legal or someone on your internal team that's handling the request, who actually needs to see what, and making sure you thought through those status, who can edit a status, who can review certain forms versus not. So just really thinking through that privacy piece. I've talked a little bit about the audit trail and inbox retention. So how are you going to retain documentation, and then so that you can actually see just the history of, if you are leveraging technology, who's made what changes when and why. So that helps to support if there is future litigation. You've got everything in a nice use of technology, from who made what request or how many requests when. You can also then think through how long is it taking for you to actually get through? What is your SLAs of getting through the different requests? So just good data points to have. All again, like, you want to be able to show your employees what you're doing, how you're working through them, make them feel that it truly is an interactive process, and bringing them along with this. The source of truth bullet here is really around what's factual versus not factual. And so a lot of organizations have different health systems or medical teams that they either have on retainer or just are working with constantly just to ask them good questions, because they want to be able to not just deny their employees accommodation requests, but again, when I opened up, how can you actually educate your employees and to provide that opportunity for education throughout the process? So, hey, we're denying this medical accommodation because actually, if this study shows whatever it might be. Again, some organizations don't want to get into that educational piece. They just want to refer out or say no. Others are really like trying to bring their employees up to that educational standard of, well, this is why we are denying it. We've got this expert that has said X, Y, and Z, and truly this means what it might mean. So I think it's just a good opportunity to think of you as you're going to go through this, and you're going to have a number of different questions that come your way. Do you have one of those partners that you want to look to help provide kind of that source of truth? The last two in here are on the parent-child company. So meaning just if, depending on how your organization is outlined, are you making sure that you're doing things consistent from a parent-child relationship, and or how will one vaccine mandate or trickle down into the other maybe operating companies. So just making sure that you've thought through kind of like what I call stakeholder management, who are going to be all the different key players, and making sure that you've thought through that experience and connection points between all of them. And the last one I've already talked about is really on this internal employee education. It's just a really nice way for you to connect with your employees and provide the reasoning and rationale, because you're going to get a lot of situations that are just kind of in the middle. Like random things that we've seen is a lot of folks have said, you know, you can either apply for one, a medical, or one, a religious accommodation, not both. But we are seeing some overlap between the requests. So for example, female fertility. So there are some folks that are making a request for a religious accommodation saying, you know, it's their sincerely held belief that it's their purpose in this life to be a mother, and so they want to do that. But then they're also making a medical accommodation request as it relates to they're doing IVF, and so they don't want to get the vaccine. So being able to connect those dots and bring those themes together is really important. Fertility has been a really big one that's come up. Overall, I think you're just going to see a lot of different issues or anxiety, and you're just going to have to come up with what are the guidelines, what are others doing, and how do you just make sure, again, that it truly is a consistent process that you are following. If we go to the next slide, I think we might be at Q&A. We are. So I know that's a lot. It really has been an interesting ride on how we've been helping just organizations think through if they are going to mandate or if they have mandated, what does that look like, and what are some of those key considerations to truly stand up a center of excellence to handle that accommodation process, because you're learning a lot as you go through that. And just being able to make sure, again, I always go from like my forensics background and crisis management background, it's very much a, what is the consistent process? How are you going to get the supporting evidence to make sure everyone feels like it was a truly trusted process that they went through? Betsy, I think you're on mute.
I am on mute, and you would think after 18 months I would know how to unmute, but it's got to happen at least once or twice a day. What I was saying is thank you so much. We are, for the presentation, as you mentioned, we've reached the Q&A, and we've got a few things that came through, and we've got a couple others that have also been sent through. So why don't I just jump on in to what's been sent. And I recognize some of the names, so I look forward to seeing them tomorrow on our workforce call as well. One of the questions that came in was, if an employee and parentheses and the ETS mandate is vaccines or testing, any reason to expect an increase in an accommodation request? If a vaccine is required, can testing be the accommodation for religious and medical requests?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I'm going to say I'm not an attorney, so I can't give you legal advice. I can say what I've seen. So one, with that, we have seen an influx in accommodations requests of the majority of organizations we're working with. And there has been, it goes back to your policy, but you can have that accommodation be testing. And so you can have it be testing, you could have it be unpaid leave, you could have it be, we're going to be working virtual, we're going to offer you a new position. But yeah, testing has been an accommodation request that we have seen being used.
Perfect. Can you comment on the global or international companies? We, of course, many of our members are global companies, and how to consider consistency given that this mandate is a US requirement. And there's like 37 other questions that like follow
around that
thread, but let's start there.
Yeah, so let me just give some personal thoughts on that. So a lot of people have been focused on US now because it's going to be a US mandate. As it relates to accommodations, interestingly enough, for a number of the organizations that we're working with, the accommodations process is primarily a US issue only. When you go globally, they're seeing a lot more of 100% vaccination rates. And also in a lot of, so then you've got to go down to like, depending on what countries you're in, you've got to have the legal analysis of if you actually can mandate or not. A lot of countries you can't mandate based on employment, but you can say that it is, if you want to go into the office, that you need to be vaccinated. So the global issue is being very interesting. I feel like a lot of organizations have really been focused on US with the thoughts to expand international, but because of the mandate laws and regs and how they are different, It's been more what can they do or not do. But I will tell you what I've seen in the large majority of my multinational clients or multinational companies has been that this accommodation world and this influx is more of a U.S. issue rather than a global issue.
Okay.
So hopefully that's helpful.
I think so. Following that thread, is unpaid LOA a reasonable accommodation? Again, this might be one of those questions. I'm not an attorney and I can't give legal advice.
I can't give legal advice to say if it is a reasonable accommodation or not. I can say it is an option that we have seen folks use as unpaid leave. But you also see that there are, if you read the headlines, there are organizations that are being sued for saying unpaid leave is actually not an appropriate one. So,
Katrina, we've got two questions that come in, but I think it gets to the heart. Does PwC or yourself, do you have a sample of what an intake form could look like? And also, do you have a sample policy that you'd be willing to share as well? Those were two questions that came in.
We could give maybe some sample questions, like just like themes, if that would be helpful. So you can reach out to me, whoever that has those questions. As a sample policy, we're not writing policies, but we can give you key themes or elements that we've seen addressed in policies. So.
And I would mention that question that came in. We had for those that participated in our exchange that we brought in, another one of our partners. They had a sort of a high level policy that we can share as well. That we can send around again.
Because Betsy, really quick on that. The policies again are varying based on client, based on organization, because of how strict or not strict they're going to be, or how accommodating. And I don't like to use the word accommodating, but because it's an accommodations request. But we've seen some that have been only if these 3 religions and these 4 medical issues, and like that's all that they're going to accommodate for. So again, it's like key themes. What's going to be your policy? What's allowed versus not allowed? And then what are those guidelines that you're going to apply that consistently across?
Well, and along those, here's another question, and this gets to the questions around workers have an option of either getting the 1-shot vaccine or the 2-shot vaccine. Do you have any perspective on accepting one versus the other? But I would say another question that I get quite frequently is how to accept vaccines, particularly if you have international employees that might be coming here either temporarily or working long-term. Can you accept the vaccines that are approved in other countries? Any insights that or perspective that you may have on that? Again, there's a lot we don't know, but those are some of the really common questions we're getting.
Yeah, those are great questions. As far as which vaccine to accept, I have not personally seen organizations distinguish that only one vaccine is accepted over the others, meaning either Pfizer, Moderna, and or J&J. That has not been a distinguishment that I've seen. The other question was a great one, and I actually haven't had issues with it. Like if you can accept a vaccine from another country that hasn't been used here in the U.S. That's fantastic. I would love to know the answer to that question because I don't know it.
Yeah, we've seen some media articles about certain ones, perhaps and others, but I think as the devil gets in the details, and particularly with many of our members having companies that if they have European employees, and that came on the heels of other questions around, should this only qualify for fully approved vaccines? And I'm not sure what kind of granularity and details we'll be getting, but that just shows the uncertainty here. Yeah,
it definitely shows the uncertainty. And again, it's organizations are either taking, we want to mandate the vaccine, so get a vaccine. Like there is some words they might say, I'm only going to allow for these ones that are approved. But I think everyone's just more trying to do the more general, higher level, go get a vaccine. Or if they don't even, some people are mandating it based on for employment. A lot of other ones are finding that in between where if you just want to come into an office where you're going to be customer or client facing. And so trying to make that distinguish.
Yeah. We got another question that just came in. Have you seen any accommodation requests for exemption from testing? We've so far been talking about vaccines. Anything that's come on the flip side?
From testing? No, I've seen requests for if there was a mask mandate and they don't want to wear masks. I have not seen anything as it relates to not being wanting to be tested or not taking that as an accommodation.
And I from a consumer brands standpoint, we haven't heard anything either, but that's an interesting question. That I think
I've seen it for the
really
mask,
focused on the mandates and not have thought about the other component of that.
That's interesting because we've seen like at the beginning before like vaccine mandates was a hot topic. It was really around mask mandates. And so if you've got organizations that are, maybe we've got workers that are in factories that are not air conditioned or something, and like, I can't breathe when I'm doing my job, so I want an exemption not to wear masks, but I have not seen it from a testing perspective.
So the $1 million question that we get asked, and someone's asked it here, is do you have any sense of timing with the ETS? And I mean, it could be tomorrow, it could be 6 months from now. That's my answer.
So I think there was, that's a fair answer, and I will second on that answer. I will just say, with the announcement that Biden made yesterday afternoon around federal agencies, I think that was ahead of its, I think it was supposed to be like the end of the month guidance. So maybe if we're going to be early, the ones for the rest of us will come early. But that was a good sign of just that one came out much earlier than anticipated.
So I want to pull on that thread, because are you talking, was the announcement made by Biden? I missed that, and I've got some people sending me notes. Are we talking about the memo that came from OPM?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. There was, something was released early or late last night around like 3 or 4, but it was really around federal agencies. And so that if they're going to do the accommodations process, what that means, and guidance was posted. And that was kind of where people were going with it.
For members, we've got the memo from OPM that was dated on the 1st, but we've got the links that go in where I think more of those details are there. We'll share it tomorrow on our exchange, but I wanted to make sure we were talking the same item.
We are.
Okay, perfect. Any thoughts on what to do with boosters? And this is, as it's coming up, how do, let's talk about, the first round, but boosters are quickly I'm due for my booster probably in the next couple months. I think many employees in this space, they were in phase 1B, 1C, depending. We sort of hit that 6 to 8 month window. Any insights?
I don't have insights on how they're going to handle the boosters. I think for organizations that are requiring vaccine mandates, and then they're actually having a way to show proof of vaccination, they're then tying that into, all right, now I've seen that you've been vaccinated, here was your last vaccination date, and if they require then boosters, they're going to track it. From an accommodation request, it doesn't really have an impact because you're not vaccinated if you're asking for an accommodation. But I see it being as part of that life cycle of, all right, we want to show proof of vaccination. And so how are employees showing proof of vaccination through Workday, through other technology, through tools like check-in that we have, whatever it might be, what is that? And then how are you then tracking to make sure that they show that they're getting the boosters? Again, if it's going to be as part of your policy that you're requiring it.
We've gotten some insights on sort of where the Department of Labor has landed on remote employees. But one of the things that have come up that I don't think we've gotten clarity and would be really interested in your perspective is around perhaps companies, temporary employees, or other outsourcing employees. And one that comes to mind is like sanitation crews that are usually third party or other type of similar things. Does that count for the 100 in the company, or is that the third party's company's responsibility? Who's responsible for the mandates? Those type of questions. Do you have any insights on that from where you've been sitting?
Yeah, so I can't say who's responsible for it because I don't think guidance has come out to give that actually who would be responsible. But as it relates to how other organizations are handling it, there's 2 camps for as it relates to third-party labor. Either you're just going to say, hey, as people are making their vaccine mandates either just for their employees, and just maybe sometimes just their employees that are even coming into the office, not the ones that are remote or virtual. Or then if there's a lot of organizations that their mandate goes to all third-party suppliers or third-party entities that they're working with. And so we can either then manage that process yourself. The more common one that I have seen is you're asking that organization to either certify or attest that all of the employees working with you as an organization are vaccinated, or letting them know that they have not been vaccinated. And either some are just flat out saying, if they're not vaccinated, you can't work with us, that specific individual, not you as a overall organization. Or if there has been an accommodation provided, what is that accommodation, and would that work for that interaction between that organization and the third party labor?
Yeah, and so mandates, but I would take it a step further, same response probably if they go to testing.
Exactly.
Yep, okay.
And are you going to provide testing? We've seen a lot of organizations provide testing for like sanitation and folks to come into the building to do sanitation, to clean. They're going to provide that testing so that they can then enter.
Yep. One of the questions that's come in, and we're going to wrap up in about 3 or 4 minutes. So if you got any last minute questions, people, this is your time. Will the mandate apply to employees who work from home?
I do not know. I haven't seen the specific guidance on it. So there again, so I can tell you how organizations are currently handling it. Some are either saying all employees as part of their employment must be vaccinated, or they will be terminated, unpaid leave, whatever it might be. Others are saying just for their employees who want to return to be physically in the office, that is who their mandate relates to.
So I sat on a webinar from DOL early on, and the DOL or OSHA implied, I think, that if you are a remote worker, the vaccine mandate likely, and again, they were careful to put all the things, does not include. And if you're outside, it depends on the type of activity. So if you were in a scenario, let's say, where you are outside but in close contact, likely it could mean the mandate. So I think there's still a lot of unknown there, but the signaling is if you are a remote worker working in a sort of your home office or a satellite office with no other contact, you're probably in the clear.
Betsy, I never like to assume anything until it actually comes out.
That's why I put all the caveats. It was an interest. I was really amazed during this webinar that week, the week of the announcement, that they said that. But I'll be curious what nets out in the final ETS, because until we see it there, I think to me, it falls under speculation.
I agree.
Will the availability of a booster shot affect what it means to be vaccinated? I think this gets to a definition in my mind. When are you vaccinated and when are you considered not vaccinated? And
again, that will go to your policy. Is how are you going to define, and or if guidance comes out that defines vaccinated. So. And
then do employees need the 1-shot series or the 2 shots plus the booster to be considered vaccinated?
It's going to depend on how the definition is.
Yep. And our last question, I promise, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you. You've been a great sport. They've just been peppering in. If testing isn't an accommodation, does the employer have to pay or coordinate for the testing?
Yeah, so that is, I have not seen this as a must. I know when we talked originally, when Biden came out, that it would either be you're vaccinated or you do weekly testing. It didn't get in kind of the details of whose cost that would be related to. I've seen a lot of organizations use that as an opportunity to help build trust with their employees to actually pay for the testing if they cannot get vaccinated due to a religious or medical accommodation. Yeah.
Well, Katrina, thank you again.
You're so welcome.
This has been great. And also want to say thank you to PwC for their partnership with Consumer Brands. We look forward to sharing additional insights from PwC in future sessions and other initiatives. Today, as I'm thinking about the takeaways, the 3 takeaways that I'm thinking of is ensure your process is consistent when implementing a mandate and engage all of the players within your company. You want to communicate your plan to employees. That's critical. And so is the documentation throughout that process. And companies should consider all stakeholders and how the mandate trickles down when in deciding on these mandates for the company. So those are some of our quick hot takes coming away from today. As a reminder, for those of you that partake in the Workforce Exchange, that is happening tomorrow at our normal time at 2 p.m. If you haven't received a calendar invitation for that exchange and would like to, please send a note to James Schwartz. His email is in the chat right there. It popped right up. And I want to say, Katrina, thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you in the next session. Take care.